There are different forms of cultural competence, but the idea is that clinicians who are working in mental health settings should be versatile in their attitudes, skills, and knowledge to be able to help a wide variety of people coming from different cultural backgrounds with minimal difficulty in accommodating those differences for purposes of offering treatment, therapy, or help. Well, this is where different models start to diverge a little bit in what they recommend. One form of cultural competence is called by psychologists a kind of person model of cultural competence, in which you take a clinician as a kind of person who should be trained in how to be knowledgeable, have the right understanding about other people's beliefs, and be skilled enough to be able to work with people from particular cultural backgrounds. So that's the kind of person, and training consists essentially of making sure that, first of all, they're aware of their own cultural embeddedness as clinicians, and they're also aware of the cultural embeddedness of clinical practice in mental health circles. And then beyond that, to become self-aware enough to be cognizant of when they can expect that people they're working with might differ around certain sets of assumptions and orientations and dispositions on cultural grounds. And therefore the exercise of kind of attitudes, knowledge, and skills in service of people's well-being. A different form of cultural competence is sometimes called a process model of cultural competence, which sees the actual therapeutic process as being what needs to be adjusted or amended to help people best, focusing on things like the kind of story a person is trying to tell you, how best to enter into that story and craft a narrative with that person that might work best for their well-being. So there are different models for this, but they do involve certainly a good deal of recognition that we are all embedded in cultural processes and practices, that we have a lot of assumptions and orientations that are cultural themselves, and these are not always shared by the people we work with. And so trying to be attentive to that and skilled in some way of taking account of those in the therapeutic session. Well, evidence-based practice is a concept that says that there ought to be a couple of components that are folded together for ideal clinical practice. And a big part of that is evidence-based treatment or intervention. That is, that one ought to be using techniques for helping people with mental health problems that have gone through rigorous scientific evaluation and provided evidence that they actually can help people. And that needs to be wedded, of course, with client characteristics of the person you're working with, as well as aspects of the clinical setting to come together into evidence-based practice. A big focus of evidence-based practice, of course, then is evidence-based treatment. And what's interesting to me about the intersection of evidence-based treatment and cultural competence is it strikes me that they come from somewhat different interests. The interest of cultural competence is to adjust, to tailor, to adapt, often on the fly, but not only, in the clinical encounter. Evidence-based treatment is meant to be more or less standardized, that the technique that you're using should be deployed with people in ways that maybe can have some superficial adaptation, but at some core level need to remain consistent, because that's what's been proven to help people, and if you depart from that, maybe you won't help them anymore. And so there's a little bit of a dilemma, I think, at the intersection of evidence-based treatment and cultural competence around how much to adapt and tailor versus how much to leave intact and standardized. And to me, that's where the interesting questions arise. I think Indigenous community settings are ideal places to observe and analyze these tensions, in part because Indigenous communities are, in many respects, post-colonial settings in which Euro-American, Euro-Canadian colonization has left a particular legacy in which many Indigenous people today are interested in looking back, returning to tradition, preserving cultural processes and practices that have survived colonization. And so there's a critique that's built into that self-awareness, which means that people are in many respects not interested in assimilating in certain quarters or domains, but rather in protecting what's traditional. In light of that, mental health services, mental health approaches and techniques are themselves cultural artifacts that come with sets of assumptions and orientations built into them. And clinicians who are unaware of those cultural assumptions and orientations might offer, in the name of helping Indigenous people, something that ends up resulting in forms of what we might call, missionary work. It's kind of cultural proselytization that happens under the radar very subtly that, a client isn't signing up for when they come for help necessarily. And so Indigenous settings provide insights into this very difficult encounter in which there's a lot of stuff happening that's beneath the radar that both clinicians and clients probably need to be much more attentive to and maybe negotiate in overt, explicit ways.